They put a price on her like a ledger entry and called it salvation. The deal was spoken with the same breath that named broken fences and overdue notes. Clara Win would marry Jessie Holt to settle a debt. The ceremony lasted less than an hour, a courthouse clerk's ink-stained fingers, a whisper of vows she had not chosen, and a town's polite indifference. By dusk she was in a wagon with the man the county had decided would be her husband, the Win ranch shrinking behind them into dust and sun. Clara had been raised on a porch that watched over their spread of scrub and corrals. She had learned how names open doors. The Win name had been like a key. To lose it felt like being locked out in broad daylight. When her father, Joris Win, spoke of commands and bargains, his voice was a whetstone against her will. He said the bank wanted interest and men wanted their wages. He said land did not care for sentiment. She had not argued, because arguing would not have bought the homestead back. She had instead watched the numbers tilt and listened for any tenderness in the faces around her. Found none. Jessie Holt rode with a quiet set to his jaw. He had a hand calloused by work and a face that did not pretend nothing mattered. He was not handsome in any manner that would distract from the bargain. He was ordinary, solid, the kind of man who could hold a rail and not break it. The town called him a servant, and the word stuck to him like dust. There was a steadiness about him that made people give him work and keep him in their kitchens, and in the light of that first evening, it did not occur to Clara that steadiness might be a kind of wealth. The cabin they reached that first night stood on a narrow shelf of land below the ranch, where the grass thinned and the hills dropped to a creek. It had been built by a hand that knew how to make shelter from rough timber. Low eaves, a narrow stoop, a stove blackened around the door. Its windows held curtains stitched from curtains and patched flour sacks. Jessie eased her down from the wagon and handed her a blanket with a motion so small it might have been a courtesy rather than a measure of kindness. Clara expected in that cabin humiliation. She expected taunts and scorn, to be refused by neighbors and left with childish comforts and the menial work her new status implied. She had pictured herself at the stove while townfolk laughed on Main Street. What she found first was silence that was not ridicule but attention. Jessie moved through the cabin with a practical gentleness, stacking wood, checking the stove, drawing water. He wiped a place on the table with an old dish towel and set down 2 tin cups. He did not ask for her gratitude. He offered a place for her things under the bed, and, in a manner that made her cheeks hot with embarrassment, he lifted his cap and said simply, "Make it your home as you can." She slept that first night face down in the guest cot, wakeful to the creak of the house settling and the steady breath of a man on the other side of the wall. When she listened, she heard boots on the porch at dawn, the soft scrape of a chair. Jessie had stoked the stove and been out before her to fetch water. He placed a small tin of coffee and a warmed biscuit by the bed, and when she sat up, he tipped his hat and went out to the corral, as if this were an entirely normal beginning. The first days were a stencil of work: split wood at dawn with an axe that knew the grain, mend a torn dress at noon with a needle that came sharp as a promise, gut fish at the creek for their supper with hands that did not flinch at the smell. Jessie taught her how to place a bit of kindling for a clean burn, how to feel the weight of a fowl before you plucked it, when the river's current hid stones that would trip a foot. He never raised his voice to her. He spoke in small instructions and shorter silences. He offered her the dignity of chores taught rather than orders barked. Pride was an awkward thing for Clara in those days. She had been given away as if she were a barrel of oats, and yet every morning she found herself mastering a small competence. The axe would bite at the log with a sound like a settled sentence. The stove would give them a steady heat. The shirt she had worn to the ceremony, worn and patched, took new stitches from her hand, and could, in time, have been mistaken for ordinary work rather than a relic of a lost house. There was a strange comfort in the ordinary continuity of labor. It took over the hours and left little room for the whirl of shame that had threatened to swallow her. If you want to see how a forced marriage becomes something else, stay with the story, a small voice might say, if any had paused at the cabin's gate. But no voice was necessary for Clara to know that the story would not unspool the way it had been written. The change would come in patience and incident rather than in speech. Not all change was soft. Once, near the creek where the bank unrolled in slick clay, Clara's foot found a mossy stone, and she went down with a shock of cold water stealing the air from her chest. The river, after a long dry season, had found pockets of sudden depth. Jessie was there before she knew she had lost her center, his hands on her shoulders, his arms under her back. He dragged her to a place where the current eased. She coughed and tasted the river, earth and iron on her tongue. His hands were steady, fingers sure. He wrapped her in his jacket and stirred a fire until warmth seeped into her limbs. He could have treated the rescue as simple service, something to be done and forgotten. Instead, he lingered as if he had taken her across an important threshold. He handed her a cup and would not look at the dress that clung to her where the fabric had darkened. He said, after a while, "You got lucky there," with a voice that had neither mock nor pity. In that sentence, the difference between them, between the owner class and the working hands, was measured not by station but by flesh. Clara found herself listening to him in ways she had not expected. There were features to his history that she had not imagined. Small scars on his knuckles, a way of tightening his mouth when he thought, the faint scent of something hard and sweet, smoke and molasses on his person. She began to notice the cadence of his days, how he performed a dozen small rituals that collected into a life, sweeping the stoop at dusk, checking the latch thrice before he lay down, folding the blankets with an economy that made them look like they had always belonged to the place. When he spoke of his mother, his voice softened as if he carried a hearth within him at all times. The chest under Jessie's bed was a thing she found one late afternoon when an old nail gave and a plank sagged. He had turned to fetch a pail and left the small trap unlatched. It was a plain cedar box, bound in iron and scrubbed by hands that had used it often. Clara slid it out from the dock and set it on her knees. She found letters with edges browned by years and a photograph folded within a scrap of cloth. The photograph was small as a coin, but it held a face, a woman with a roundness at her mouth and an apron stained with work, looking into the camera as if she were seeing the future with a kind of brave calm. On the back was ink scrawled in a hand that trembled and then grew firm. Clara pressed the page with the tip of her finger and felt an intimacy that was not owed to her. She had no right to peer into this private history, and yet the chest felt like a gift. It let her measure, in a sudden and honest way, what Jessie had been given and what he had chosen to keep. When Jessie returned and found her with the box, he stood at the doorway for a long moment without stepping in. His face carried both surprise and a small, nearly imperceptible caution. He sat then and took the photograph from her fingers with the care of a man handling a small treasure. "That's my ma," he said. The sentence was thin, but whole. He did not offer that he had been born to servitude like an accusation. He mentioned it like weather. It was not the point he wished to linger on. The point for him was what she saw in the photograph, what she understood without him telling. "My mother taught me how to make a bed so it would feel like a place to stay whether you owned the roof or not," he said, and there was a smile that had known many winters in the curve of it. "She said you take care of what you can and leave the rest to be better for the next person." Clara felt a sudden and sharp affection, not for the photograph, but for the voice that kept returning to care, to dignity in small things. Those lessons had not been taught in any school of pedigree. She began to recognize how his life had been stitched together by choice and habit rather than by the inheritance of land. It was in the quiet economy of their days that something mutual began to grow, not a thing of fireworks or declarations, but a new way of standing in the world beside another person. Jessie would mend the hem of a work shirt, and she would bring him bread she had saved from supper. He would catch a trout, and she would scale it and set it on the pan. They found, in the repetition of tasks, a slow exchange of trust. Clara found that her hands had learned a sort of language, knots that held, stitches that would not pop, the right angle to pry loose a stuck window. On evenings when the sky grew a washed indigo and the hills softened into smudged outlines, they sat side by side on the stoop and watched the valley breathe. The town's lamps winked at a distance, and dogs barked in the rhythm of home. They did not speak much. There was pleasure in a silence that did not demand performance. When they did talk, it was about small matters, what the sheriff had said that day at market, whether the rain might hold until the wheat finished its hold on the earth. Once Jessie told a story about a horse that had once bolted, and how a neighbor had grabbed its bridle with his bare hands until the dust settled. The story was a demonstration of steadiness, not of his own heroics, and Clara smiled at the way he placed valor as an ordinary habit. She came to value the ways he refused to belittle her. He never called her by the Win title. He used her given name as if it were made of better cloth. Clara, he said when he meant to draw her into the ordinary world, and the name felt like an invitation. Names, she had learned, could keep a person as much as a house could. When she tried to speak of the old life, to let anger or grief out in the only way she had known, by declaring it loudly, he would close his mouth and hand her some task. It worked, in a strange and healing fashion. Doing the work made the grief manageable, tempered the sharpness into something like grain. There were roughnesses, too. The valley's air was not free of gossip. Men at the rail in town would tilt their hats and whisper in ways that made it clear they perceived her as diminished. Melwyn, her stepmother, was cruel in a way that felt rehearsed. She would pass the cabin and drop a mocking nod, as if the entire arrangement were a charm to be undone by ridicule. Joris's boys offered her contempt in thin measures. The sheriff, Dade, came twice with questions, once about whether the homestead had accepted the transfer, once to ask after the stove's flue. His eyes, honest and plain, carried an index of the town's curiosity. No one came with blessing. People came with paperwork, with gossip, with the neat, small cruelty of believing their account of someone's worth. Still, inside the cabin, a different accounting took shape. When Jessie lay awake at night after fetching water, Clara sometimes rose and found him sitting by the stove, turning one of his mother's letters with patient fingers. He would not sleep when she could be worried in the dark, and she realized with a private astonishment that she did not fear waking to him. He had, through his acts, become a protector of a kind that neither insulted nor oversaw her. Protection arrived as an everyday practice, watching the door, tending the horse, fixing a fence in the rain so their stock would not stray. Their companionship did not erase the injustice of how the marriage began. Clara kept that edge to herself like a winter garment. There were nights she wept not for the loss of land. They could not be reclaimed, but for the loss of the life she had imagined, the way a child might grieve for a future fair day that will not come. Jessie did not try to talk her out of those sorrows. He sat beside her, and sometimes he put his hand on the small of her back until the tremors passed. That was the first time she felt that some part of her would choose to remain here. He had his own vulnerabilities. One evening, as rain hammered the tin roof and the creek sent a distant throbbing music down the valley, Jessie opened the chest for her and let her read the letters aloud. The handwriting was crooked at first, perhaps written by candlelight, and tended into clearer strokes as the years passed. The letters were not full of riches or schemes, they were full of ordinary counsel. One line caught her more than the rest. "You are always worthy when you keep your hands busy and your heart honest," Clara read, and the words seemed to settle into the room like a blanket. She asked him then, because names had become the small currency of their exchange. "What would you have been if not someone other people had told you to be?" He looked at the fire, at the slow curl of flame, and answered, "A man who'd be counted for his work, I suppose. A man who'd be trusted. That's enough for me." There was no bitterness in the sentence, only a measured contentment shaped by hard days. She believed him. She believed, too, that he measured a life by how it was given rather than by how it was branded. There were tender accidents that forged their intimacy. A tea spill on his sleeve that she scrubbed out until the cloth looked new. A morning when she walked to the creek only to find him there with a net, patiently sweeping for minnows to fry. Once, in a brief moment of levity, he whistled a tune that was older than either of them. She hummed along without thinking, and the sound surprised them both. His laughter, when she made a clumsy attempt at mending, was a sound she had not heard since she was a child in the main house. It loosened something inside her. Yet Clara did not confuse familiarity with absolution. She kept her mind sharp to the facts of their start, that she had been offered in exchange, that the Win name would no longer open the doors it had before. What altered was this. The house that had once sheltered privilege now sheltered two people who made a home by their own effort. That fact did not wipe out the memory of coercion, it gave it context. It taught her that even forced beginnings could give rise to deliberate, tender things if both parties chose to respond in ways that honored the other's personhood. News from town moved like a slow cloud. A neighbor would stop with a loaf and, after a cautious exchange, slip that loaf with eyes lowered and a comment about the weather, never the state of their marriage. People assumed that her days would be a series of humiliations. Instead, they were a ledger of small mercies. She mended a child's jacket that the neighbor's son had ruined, and the woman who left the jacket nodded without irony when she came to collect it. Little shifts like that were not the town's renunciation, but a changing pattern in the way neighbors treated the cabin's doors. One afternoon, when the sun lay soft against the hills and the air held the smell of cut grass, Clara sat with the photograph from Jessie's chest propped on her knee. She had taken to tucking the picture into the Bible she read sometimes, not out of sanctity, but because both objects gave her a sense of continuity. She imagined the mother in the photograph speaking to Jessie in her plain, tough way, telling him to keep his head, to treat others well, to measure himself by his hands. It was during that hour that she made the first choice that was entirely her own since the bargain. Clara Win's shadow had shrunk into rumor. The ranch worked the way it would, whether she stood on the porch or not. Clara got up and walked to the edge of the property line, where a low post marked the point at which land shifted from one holding to the next. She stood with her palms on the post and listened to the valley, grass hissing, a lone hawk complaining in the blue. The world had not promised to be kind to her, but neither had it decided that she could not live. She felt, for the first time, the possibility of making an active choice to stay, not out of resignation but because here, by the stove, with a man who refused to measure her by the weight of a name, she could practice a different life. When she walked back into the cabin, Jessie was standing at the window looking out toward the distant ridge. He turned, and the light caught the scar on his cheek, an old ledger of work and survival. "You look like you're deciding something," he said. She sat and told him, in a voice that did not tremble as it might have, that she would remain. She told him that the choice was not a neat thing to offer him. It was not a contract, and it was not a rusted chain. "I will live here if you'll let me," she said. The sentence was a hand extended across a table. It was also an admission that she still feared what the world would call their arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment. "I can't change what started this," he said finally, "but I can, if you let me, make the things that matter right." There was no offering of grand redemption, no promise he could not keep. Instead, he offered the work of a life, honest labor, steady presence, the small things that would add up. Clara heard in his words the kind of truth that had not been taught in her childhood, that dignity could be built by daily acts and not only inherited. After that, days began to feel like the building of something that might outlast small cruelties. They planted a patch of beans and watched them climb the trellis. Jessie taught her to drive a nail so it took the weight, and she learned which cuts of meat would feed them longest. They marked the weather with the way the stove smoked, the way the creek rose, the way the dog at the neighbor's place barked at dusk. The neighbors slowed in steps of regard. Some leveled their contempt less often, and others brought over a small comfort, a pie, a cup of sugar, without the smirk that had once accompanied such gestures. Still, the valley was not forgetful. Rumor had a long memory, and the town had a way of measuring people against the ledger of old standings. Voices rose now and then at the general store. "Win gave her away," a man would say, and the register of worth was reopened, as if the act itself could be the final argument. Other voices, softer ones, would counter, and the line of argument would ink itself into the town's record. Clara's own sense of self changed not in any sweeping revelation, but in small private corrections. She began to sleep with one of Jessie's shirts folded beside her, as if to remember the man she had chosen to remain with. She found, in the days of mending and cooking and tending, that there were moments when fear eased and was replaced by a protective tenderness she had not expected to feel. When she saw Jessie rise before dawn in winter to stoke the stove so she would not wake cold, a warmth unconnected to the stove grew inside her. It felt like a slow secret granting itself to both of them. One night, as summer leaned toward its end and the smell of harvested fields began to linger on the wind, Clara found herself speaking of an idea that had formed in her like a pebble turned in a pocket. "If a child came to live with us," she said softly, "it would be a sign that we've made something better from a poor start." Jessie did not smile at the thought immediately. He cupped his hands around the cup of coffee and watched it steam. Then he said, "There's nothing wrong with asking the world to be better," and he said it without irony. The words were not a vow. They were a willingness to imagine a future they might shape together. That image, of a child, a new life, settled between them like an ember. It did not banish the past, but it offered a direction, toward growth and repair. Clara kept the photograph of Jessie's mother in her Bible and would sometimes read the opening lines of the letters aloud, as if to acquaint herself with the grammar of the man beside her. In the week that followed, the valley carried a rumor in its usual slow way, that the Win Ranch had finally stopped arguing the transfer. Men came and went with the same indifferent expressions, but this time their talk included small surprise notes about the Holt place. "They keep good coffers," one man muttered at the feed store. "She keeps the best bread I ever ate," said another. The commentary did not amount to apology. It was simply recalibration. People begin to measure what they see. Then, as the sun tipped into its more honest light, and the first thin threads of autumn rippled through the grasses, a stranger came to the cabin with a message from town. The sheriff wanted to know whether they wished to keep any kind of ledger of debts. Clara Win's name came with it. Jessie met the messenger at the gate with no ostentation and returned with the letter folded upon itself like a small promise. The envelope carried the weight of a comeback. Clara read it and felt the old muscle of fear flex for a moment. The letter said only logistics and matters of signature, but the subtext was heavier. The world would not relinquish what it had attempted to take for free. That night, when the stars were pricked and the house smelled of stew and mended wool, Clara looked at Jessie and saw how a soft trade had happened between them. Privacy and care for loyalty, small acts for new loyalties. She felt the truth of those trading hands as something that could be defended not by ledger, but by presence. She told herself that whatever came from beyond the ridge, she would not cede the life they were building without a firm voice. They had, between them and the stove and the fields, built a truth that did not require the town's permission. It was fragile, a thing still young and tender. But it was there, woven into the days like a new seam. Clara felt, for all the years she had known of names and houses, that perhaps the most radical thing she could do was to keep showing up for a life she had chosen to remain in, choosing not to be defined by the terms that had been put on her, but by the things she and Jessie did when no one watched. When the moon was thin and the air carried the last of the summer's heat, she stood on the stoop and listened. The valley was not as suppressed as the town expected. It breathed, and in its breathing was the sound of a life beginning to belong to itself. Far beyond the hills, the ranch lights blinked like a record of the past, patient and indifferent. Closer, the chest with its photograph and letters sat on the shelf, the small archive of a man's honesty. Clara folded her hands as if in prayer and, without a formal utterance, decided to resist being treated like a ledger entry any longer. Her decision did not turn back time. It simply placed the weight of her future on the scales she could touch. A stove, a bed, the way she said Jessie's name, the stitches she sewed in the evening. The choice to stay was not a denial of wrong, but an acceptance of work. She turned as a hoofbeat sounded along the road, distant at first, then clearer. The shape of a stranger riding toward the cabin cut the last slice of light. Clara straightened and watched as the rider's silhouette left a trail of dust in the lane. The sound carried a question with it, and with that question, the calm of their day shifted, as if the valley itself had taken a slow breath and held it. The rider reined at the fence like a man who had come to split a night in two. Dust clouded his horse's flanks, and his hat rim was a dark halo against the waning light. Behind him came another shape, then more, hoofbeats that made the valley itself seem to shift. Clara watched the dust bloom and felt a slow tightness draw across her ribs. News came on wind and hoof. It had a smell to it, like iron and old grievances. Jessie rose from where he had been pacing by the porch and went to the gate with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. He did not ask, he simply opened the latch and let the men step off their horses. Clara Win led them, his coat scored with dust, his jaw set as if made of a different kind of stubborn than the land. He carried the look of a man who had expected compliance and found instead the quiet audacity of a home. "You ought not to be here," Clara said, and his voice cut like the edge of a knife. It carried the authority of a name and the small cruelty of a scored ledger. He looked at Clara not as a daughter but as a sum to be corrected. Around him, the men took in the cabin and the stove smoke and lowered their hats in a way that was meant to be a tribute to the arrangement that had been forced upon them. Clara stepped forward. She had rehearsed nothing. Words that mattered were not the ones he had used to give her away, they were the ones she had claimed in the dark of the cabin. Her name, a choice to remain. "You have no right to tear my life out of my chest," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. It was not defiant in the way of a child. It was the hardness of someone who had learned the weight of things by lifting them. Joris's mouth thinned. Melwyn, her stepmother, stood back on the porch with a look on her face as if watching an old play where she held the best lines. "You sit here and pretend to be content," Melwyn said, more insult than question. "You disgrace the house." There was a hush, the kind that comes when a town waits for a spectacle. The men at Joris's back commented in clipped whispers. Some spat on the ground, as if that were how to judge a woman's worth. One of them, a nephew of Joris's perhaps, stepped forward with a sneer that was almost a pose. "You think you have any choice in this, girl?" he asked. "You reckon you'll be happy living in a box with a servant?" Jessie had kept his hands open at his sides. He did not look like a man prepared to shout. He looked like a man who had learned the economy of presence. He stepped so that his shoulder sat between Clara and the wide arc of the father's anger. "This is his home now, too," he said quietly. "You won't take her by force from it." Taken at first for impertinence, the sentence landed like a stone. Joris laughed, a short bark with no real mirth. "You will not tell me," he began, but the sentence broke. Pride can be a kindling. It can also expose the dry rot beneath. The men shifted, the horses scented the tension, and a dog gave a single complaining bark far down the lane. "Jessie," Clara said, not to stop him but because she wanted to name the person who had stepped between them. The name made the man present like a fact. She did not call him Holt as a title. She said his name the way she had learned to say it, a syllable packed with the small history of the last months. "You will not take me anywhere I do not choose to go," she added. "I am not property you may claim or reclaim." The words were a red cloth to the men behind Joris. One of them reached for the pistol at his hip, an old worn thing with a brass rim, and the gesture was made with the casualness of men who believed ownership extended to people. The motion was quick, a hand slipping to leather, a slight shift in weight. Jessie moved before the hand had left the holster, as if a bell had tolled inside him. He put his body between Clara and the gun with the reflex of someone who had practiced place and protection. The shot ripped into the air. It sounded as though the valley had been struck in a soft place. Jessie's shoulders took the impact. The canvas of his coat flared, and he staggered but did not fall straight away. Blood darkened his shirt at the shoulder, an obscene, sudden stain against the plain fabric. He kissed the dirt with a face that folded in on itself like a small animal taking shelter. Clara went to him, as if pulled by a rope from the inside. She fell to her knees and pressed her hands to the wound, not thinking of neatness or the right way to apply pressure, only of stopping the steady give of red. The men at Joris's back swore and shifted, and for a moment the world narrowed to the two of them, a woman and a wounded man, the harsh smell of gun smoke and the copper of blood filling the small space. "By God," Joris said, and for the first time there was a noise in his voice that was not merely command. He pushed at the men, as if to make them do what he should have done. "By God, what have you done?" Sheriff Dade had been in the lane when the rider first came. He had stayed because the law had a way of lingering where trouble brewed. He stepped forward now, his hands empty but steady. He had the look of a man used to sorting broken things without making them worse. "No more firing," he said. "We do not need another body on this land." The men muttered. One of Joris's party had a hand on his horse, eager to mount, and to be away from blood and trouble. Melwyn covered her mouth as if to keep a scream from herself. The sheriff moved with a quiet authority, and the men scattered like leaves. Joris remained, his chest heaving, his face gone the pale of someone who had reached the edge of himself. They laid Jessie on an old blanket and carried him into the cabin, careful at first, and then with the urgency of people who feared the worst. The bullet had hit his shoulder and nicked his lung. Coughing blood came in bitter little bursts. Dr. Ambrose Kent came with them, called from town as soon as someone thought to fetch a physician. He arrived with a bag of instruments and a gravity that matched the situation. "He's still breathing before I get him torn open," the doctor said, and his hands were quick and practical. He knelt and worked in the thin light, his fingers smelling of ether and spirit. He set a thin pipe and asked for a cup of hot water. The cabin filled with the smell of antiseptic and wood smoke, a combination that was closer to prayer than any words. Clara sat by Jessie with her hands still on his body, feeling the tremor of him under her palms. He coughed and looked at her, and in that look there was no theater, only an honest, sudden fear and an equal, stronger stubbornness. "Stay with me," he muttered, like a child's plea to an elder they trusted. "Don't go." His fingers fumbled for her hand with a new and surprised clumsiness. She stayed. She watched Dr. Kent work, helping when asked, tying bandages, holding the basin when her hand did not want to fail. The doctor spoke to her in small sentences that cut through sentiment. "Keep pressure here. No heat yet. He mustn't stand." There was no whisper of romance in those instructions, only the blunt care of saving what could be saved. Outside, the valley held its breath, and the men retreated to their horses. Joras stood by the fence as if the wood itself could bear the shame better than it could. People gathered at the edge of the property like a slow tide. Gossip had the speed of weather when war had been made public. Some looked at Clara with eyes sharpened by old notions, others with the curiosity of those who had seen violence and came to count the cost. The night fell like a curtain once Dr. Kent had finished, and the cabin quieted to the business of watching. Jessie slept with his chest bound and his breathing shallow. Dr. Kent's prognosis was careful. The bullet had not struck anything vital, but had planted a stubborn bruise in the lung. Infection was the real threat in the weeks to come, and bandages would have to be kept clean. "He will mend," the doctor said finally. "He is made of good grain. He will mend if we tend him right." Clara would not leave the cabin the first night. She sat at the foot of the bed, with her knees pressed to the old board floor, and watched him breathe. When his fingers twitched, she would squeeze them and talk in a low voice about trivial things to keep the dark from making room for pain. "You are stubborn," she told him. "Stubborn like an old mule." He smiled dimly at that and squeezed back, and she startled at the fact that his hand felt like a promise. Days passed in a liminal quiet, where the world both collapsed and rebuilt itself. Jessie's recovery was measured in small victories. The first time he ate a bowl of stew without coughing. The first morning he could sit up and take coffee without blood staining the rim. Dr. Kent came twice a day. He offered practical praise and a firm manner that kept fear from taking root. "Keep him warm, keep him still," he said, and he regarded Clara with a professional kindness. "This woman knows what to do. She's better than most caretakers I've seen." The town did not respond as a chorus so much as a shift in the weight of opinions. The men who had ridden in with Joras watched from the distance of their livelihoods and found that what they had expected to break had not snapped. Instead, it had held together in ways they had not anticipated. They spoke less of the ledger and more in uncertain tones about the man in the cabin who had taken a bullet for a woman they had already decided was beneath them. One morning, when Jessie had been able to stand and lean on a chair without color draining from his face, Clara sat beside him and said what she had not said with the firmness that had come to her in small increments. "I love you," she told him. The words were not theatrical. They dropped into the room like seeds in soft soil. She might have left for any number of other reasons. She had chosen to stay. Choice births a different word for what follows. Love in their small house had been measured by acts. Bread shared, stitches made, a shoulder offered at night. Jessie's face softened as if heat had found a place under frost. He could not speak much for days, but when he did, his voice had a new edge to it. "I love you too," he said, and there was a trembling in it like a man who had not been allowed to speak before finding his tongue. "Scared to hell of losing you. Not scared of dying, but of leaving you in a world that thinks it can count a life by a name." She pressed her forehead to his. Their foreheads met like two things finely arranged so the world might see them in their proper angles. He had bled and mended, and he had confessed not to a drama, but to a simple, hard feeling that had grown like lichen on a stone, quiet, persistent. It was the kind of truth that had the weight of a tool, useful, honest. Word spread then in a different key. Men at the feed store who had once tipped their hats sent over pots of stew. Neighbors brought sugar and a quiet nod, the kind that meant, "I saw, and I have nothing to add to chastisement." Sheriff Dade visited more often with no badge of lecture, just to check in. He stayed to talk of the weather and the repairs that needed to be made around the corral, like a man who knew the best way to practice kindness was to treat someone as a neighbor first. Joris watched as if the repairs around Jessie's life were a rebuke he could not recognize. He came by once, with a face that had the color of a man beaten down by more than weather. He stood by the fence and watched the two of them on the stoop, Jessie with his arm in a sling and Clara darning a shirt. After a long time he called out, "You keep to your place," and the line was put through as if nothing of consequence had occurred. He did not come any closer. Melwyn's visits became fewer. At first she passed with the same old small cruelty, but the barbs no longer landed as they had. People around her found that the story had shifted, if not their hearts, then their ears. When she dropped a word meant to embarrass, more often than not, a neighbor passed by with a stew pot and moved on. The rhythm of ridicule had lost some of its percussive power. Springs changed as the river rose with snowmelt, and the valley wore the first green of a season more forgiving than the last. The days that followed Jessie's recovery were quieter and less heroic than the town might have preferred. The real revolution had been in habits. He mended fences with the same attentive hand as ever. Clara taught a neighbor's girl how to sew a hem that would hold. They planted more beans and found that the soil that had once seemed as stubborn as a father's temper yielded small miracles when tended to with patience. Time, which had been a ledger that Joris had once thought he could balance with a marriage contract, moved differently now. Clara found that she held laughter in her hands as naturally as she held a needle. She learned to look at Jessie not as the man who had been a servant, but as the partner who woke before dawn to stack wood so their stove would not go out in winter. The difference in labels did not vanish. It ceased to have the power to decide their worth. When Clara discovered she was with child, there was a quiet astonishment in the cabin. It came in a morning when she felt faint at the wash basin and laughed at the smallness of the feeling. Jessie stood with his hand on the back of a chair, feeling as if the news were a thing he could not yet name. "We'll need more beans," he said at last, the practical note of a man who measured life by provisions. They both laughed then, the sound a release of a long-wound string. The pregnancy became a slow work of its own. Dr. Kent was cautious and wise. He advised gentle care and steady food. Clara changed the way she walked as if she were balancing something soft inside her. The town, in its slow recalibration, offered congratulations in ways that surprised her. A neighbor left a basket of eggs on the stoop with a note that read simply, "Keep the child warm." The note did what the rest of the town had been slow to do. It acknowledged this new life without a ledger. There were those who still muttered, old men who kept their accounts rigid. Joris stopped by once and stood at the gate. He watched them from a distance as if trying to figure out how to fit the scene into his old calculations. He did not speak then. His silence was a small concession. It was not the same as apology, but it was not denial either. Some things soften not because of words, but because they are worn down by the weather of seeing. When the baby came, the valley had the hush of a harvest morning. Clara labored in the cabin with Jessie at her side, his hand a constant presence on her forehead. Dr. Kent moved with a steady hand and a low voice that cut the edge off fear. The birth was neither miraculous nor merely mechanical. It was a long endurance that required all the patience they had learned in months of mending and quiet work. There were moments of pain so raw that words failed, and moments of calm where a breath seemed to fill the room like prayer. When the child arrived, she came with a thin, high wail and the small, stubborn features of a survivor. They wrapped her in a blanket that had been mended by Clara's own hands, a patchwork of fabrics that smelled of flour and clothes and the smoke of the stove. Jessie held the child as if he were balancing the world on his lap. He looked at Clara with a softness that had no need for grand statements. "She is a mercy," he said, and the word fit like a glove. "She is our mercy," Clara answered, and the way she said it sealed something both private and public. They named the child Grace, not as a flourish, but as recognition. Grace, the name, breathed the story they had lived. An unearned gift, something that arrived and altered the ledger of their days in ways that paper never could. The valley met the child in small ways. A woman from down the lane left a knitted cap on the porch rail. A man at the corral offered to mend the fence without charge. Sheriff Dade brought a small seal of bread and sat a little while to make sure all was well. Melwyn, who had been stony and sharp earlier, stopped in once with an awkward offering, a jar of preserves, and left more quickly than she had arrived. Her eyes for a split second showed something that might have been pity. Whether it was regret or merely the sight of another way to live, Clara could not tell. It was enough that the act was merciful. Months stitched themselves into years with the steady rhythm of chores. Grace grew in her father's arms and in her mother's lap, and she learned the valley's sounds and the cadence of its birds. She learned to listen to the creak of the door as a prelude to stories and the song of the creek as a lullaby. People in town began to refer to the cabin not as the place of scandal, but as a place with a child on the stoop. The shift was not complete. Old measures die slowly. But the weight of ridicule had been softened by evidence. A man who had shielded his wife and lived. A woman who had chosen to stay and been found strong. A child who required a community's gentler touch. On certain afternoons, when the sun fell so that the hills looked like paper cutouts and the corral cast long straight shadows, neighbors would come and sit on planks, leaning against fence posts and talk of the weather. Conversations that had once been a litany of scorn became about who needed a hand with a coil of wire or who could spare a dozen eggs. Habits changed, not all at once and not in a way that made Joris's ledger disappear, but they changed in the only currency that had ever mattered, how people treated each other when they thought no one was measuring them. There were moments when Joris might have recognized his daughter as a person rather than an entry. Once, at the edge of harvest, he came with a small load of feed and set it down by the barn. He said nothing of the past. He spoke instead about the condition of the cattle and the weather. His face was older than it had been the day they made the bargain. His hands had more tremor. He did not seek forgiveness, nor did he demand it. Whether his gesture was reconciliation or merely routine, it mattered less than the fact that he had come and left with no attempt at dictate. Clara nodded at him, as one would to a difficult neighbor, and something like a thin peace took root. It was not victory, it was the possibility that what had been wounded might be stitched. Years passed. Grace learned to walk the tracks around the cabin and to pick wildflowers that had no proper name, and she called everything small and precise things with the bluntness of children who name the world frankly. She knew her father as the man who would lift her onto his shoulders, and her mother as the woman who stitched her clothes and read aloud from a book with edges softened by use. She grew in a house where names meant less than the way hands moved. People in town slowed in their chatter. At the store, men spoke of the Holt place with an odd respect that was once absent. He gave his life, one would say, and there was no need to make it more than it was. What had shocked them was not a hidden fortune or a last-minute legal trick. It was a simple, stubborn fact. A man stood between a woman and a bullet, and his life bent to the work of mending. That sight, offered in the plainest way, had altered some small architecture of their beliefs. On a late afternoon when the air smelled faintly of smoke and the dog at the neighbor's yard lay in a heap of sun, Clara stood with Jessie by the fence and watched as Grace chased a butterfly like something with no ledger to consult. Jessie hooked his arm across the small of Clara's back and pulled her close. He did not take her by force, he only made a room between them and the world. "You ever think," he said softly, "that names might mean something different as you get older?" She smiled and let a small laugh escape. "I think they become what we decide to do with them," she answered. "You made Holt into something larger than a title. You made it a verb if a person could do that." He hummed then, a tune with no name, and looked at the child who had stopped to pick a scrap of grass. "We done all right," he said, the plainness of the phrase a measure of things both small and enormous. Clara looked at him, and then past him at the valley, at the lines of the hills that had been witness to their days. The town's mockery had not been a single act. It had been a chorus that had tried to decide their value. The truth that shocked everyone had not been a hidden title or a found fortune. It was the steady Sabbath of a man's courage, the careful mercy of a woman who chose to stay, the common work of two people who built a life by the slow accrual of care. That truth had weight because it was earned. It shook the ledger not by erasing it, but by presenting a more honest way to count. When visitors came, neighbors bringing pies, the sheriff dropping by to see Grace, they did not come to witness the scandal. They came to witness a household that had learned to be made of service, protection, and tenderness. They came to learn, perhaps unconsciously, that dignity could be built by hands as surely as by names. Joris watched sometimes from a distance. He did not always meet their eyes, but his shoulders were a little less rigid when he passed the gate. Melwyn, when she saw the child, softened in a way that had nothing to do with her pride and everything to do with the sight of a new life they could not dismiss. In the end, the valley wrote the couple into its map, not because the town had forgone its notions of standing, but because the facts of a life are stubborn things. A man who had once been called a servant held his family through risk and mending. A woman who had been offered as an answer to a debt chose to remain in a house she made with a man who would stand in the line of fire. Grace grew with the stitchwork of both their days. The truth that had shocked everyone was not a late twist of fortune, but the plain discovery that courage and care can overturn ledger lines more surely than any contract. Clara often thought of the photograph from the cedar chest, the woman with the apron who had taught Jessie how to make a bed feel like home wherever a roof might be. She thought of letters by firelight and of a stove that had warmed them through hard winters. The cabin had become a book of small acts, wood cut and stacked, a shirt mended, a child held when she cried. People in town learned to speak of the Holt place with a new tone, not exactly reverence but something like acknowledgement. On an evening of the second year, with the valley settled into the long quiet of summer, Clara and Jessie stood side by side on the stoop as they had once watched the light fall across the ridge. Grace was asleep inside, wrapped in the patched blanket that smelled of flour and smoke. They watched the sun touch the hills like a hand remembering the contours of something beloved. "You surprised me," Clara said. It was not a reproach, but a marvel. "You surprised me too," he answered. They stood with their hands linked and a small, quiet dignity that needed no paper to verify it. The world beyond the fence still had ledgers and men who thought names could decide everything. But in the valley where they lived, the people's accounts had been, in time, rewritten by a different reckoning, by a man's courage, a woman's choice, and the steady, ordinary acts that make a life worth living. Grace woke in the night and began to cry, and Jessie rose with the practiced gentleness of a man who had learned the true economy of care. He carried her to the stoop and handed the child to Clara, who hummed a soft old tune that had no title. The three of them stood under a sky thick with stars, and the valley exhaled as if in approval. The truth that had shocked everyone had done its work not by spectacle but by the quiet patience of being proven. When the story of the Win Ranch and the bargain that followed came up in the town years later, people told it differently. Some told it as a cautionary tale about pride and its poor accounting. Others told it as a story of humility and of the way mercy walks into the world. Children who had been too small to remember the gunshot learned the name Grace and asked what it meant. Their parents would answer in different ways, but the answer that echoed in the valley was always simple. It meant that even the poorest start could become the richest thing when two people decided to become more than what others had written for them. Clara and Jessie grew older. Lines marked their faces where laughter had been frequent and sorrow had been honest. They still worked the land in the manner of people who had learned the rhythms of survival, and they took pride in small things. A repaired hinge, a good crop of beans, a child's tooth coming in straight. They had few illusions about grandeur. What they possessed was something quieter and harder to counterfeit. A household that had been built on purpose, chosen each morning with the clumsy human labor of staying. On days when the wind came down like a hand ruffling the grasses, people would see them on the stoop, two figures not defined by pedigree but by the steady occupation of each other's company. They would tip their hats differently now, or sometimes not at all. No loud renunciation ever came from Duras, and no triumphant apology was needed. The valley, in its own time and with its own weather, had made a space where a woman's choice and a man's courage mattered more than the weight of a name. They had been mocked, yes, a woman who married a servant. But the truth that followed was not theatrical. It was a sequence of small, honest acts that tested and proved itself. Jessie had bled and lingered and tended, and Clara had chosen the life she would lead. Grace, with her sticky hands and unanswering questions, ran barefoot in the yard and taught anyone who watched that new life needs no permission. Under the wide, indifferent sky, they stood together. The town's gossip softened into respectful distance. The valley kept the story in the way it keeps all things of consequence, in the tilt of a porch, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a child's laughter. The people who had once mocked them found themselves confronted not by spectacle but by steadiness, and steadiness in that place and time had a power all its own. Clara pressed a kiss to Jessie's shoulder, the shoulder that once took a bullet, and felt beneath his skin the small living proof of what they had built. They had taken a beginning that was forced, and, with the relentless labor of choosing, turned it into something that could not be bought back. The valley was softer for it. The town had been taught, in the bluntest way, that dignity came from acts and not from names. And that truth, quiet, stubborn, and human, was the thing that had finally shocked everyone.